The gathering storm. The sun's rays broke through the clouds, illuminating the plaza in front of the Royal Guard post. The area was a bustling hub, teeming with tourists eager to capture memories of their visit. It was a place known not just for its scenic beauty, but for the unwavering discipline and ceremonial grandeur of the Royal Guards. Standing immaculately in their uniforms, the guards were symbols of order and tradition, admired by many, yet occasionally mocked by those who misunderstood their purpose. Among the crowd was a man who instantly commanded attention, not for admirable reasons, but because of his loud voice and overbearing demeanor. He was tall, with an air of arrogance, wearing sunglasses that reflected his contempt for the world around him. His name was Edward Grayson, a businessman who believed his success granted him the license to act however he pleased. To him, life was a game where money and status dictated who mattered and who didn't. As Edward pushed through the crowd, people instinctively moved aside, not out of respect, but out of discomfort. His voice boomed over the murmurs of excited tourists. "Why are we even stopping here?" he scoffed. "To see these, what do you call them? Guardians of tradition. Seriously." The sarcasm in his voice was thick, cutting through the festive atmosphere like a blade. He glanced at the Royal Guards, his lip curling in disdain. The guard closest to him was a black man, tall and imposing, his uniform spotless and his posture flawless. He stood with unwavering stillness, exuding an aura of quiet strength. Edward smirked, nudging his companion, a timid woman named Laura who seemed embarrassed to be seen with him. "Look at him," Edward sneered, pointing at the guard. "Just standing there like a statue. What a job, huh? I bet they don't even move unless someone tells them to." The crowd, sensing the shift in mood, fell silent. Some glanced at Edward with disapproval, while others tried to ignore him, hoping the moment would pass. But Edward thrived on attention, and the stillness of the crowd only fueled his ego. "Hey, you," Edward called out, his voice dripping with mockery as he addressed the guard. "Do you even know what I'm saying? Or are you just trained to ignore people like me?" The guard did not respond. His eyes remained fixed forward, his posture unyielding. Edward's grin widened. He took the guard's silence as weakness, an invitation to push further. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or are you too scared to speak?" Edward taunted. "I bet you're used to taking orders, huh? People like you always are." A ripple of unease spread through the crowd. Some tourists shifted uncomfortably, their phones poised to record the escalating confrontation. A few whispered to each other, debating whether to intervene, but the tension in the air made them hesitate. Edward stepped closer to the guard, his voice growing louder. "You think you're important because you're wearing that uniform. You're just a decoration, a prop for tourists to take pictures with." Still, the guard remained silent. His calm demeanor seemed to magnify the ugliness of Edward's words. The tourists who had initially laughed nervously at Edward's antics now looked at him with disgust. "Say something, will you?" Edward barked, his voice echoing in the plaza. "Or are you just here to make the place look good? Maybe they picked you because they needed some diversity, huh? A token to show they're inclusive." The crowd gasped. Some turned away, unable to bear the cruelty of Edward's words, while others stared in stunned silence. The guard, however, did not flinch. His stillness was not one of fear, but of unshakable resolve. It was a silent defiance that spoke louder than any words could. Edward, frustrated by the lack of reaction, leaned closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You're nothing," he hissed. "Just a pawn. You stand here, silent and obedient, while the real people, the important people, make the rules. That's all you'll ever be." For a moment, it seemed as if the entire world had stopped. The air was thick with tension, the crowd holding its collective breath. Edward's words hung in the air like a dark cloud, but the guard remained unmoved, his silence a fortress that Edward's insults could not penetrate. Then something shifted. It was subtle, a faint murmur in the crowd, a shared glance between strangers. The tide was turning, though Edward was too blinded by his own arrogance to notice. The guard's silence was no longer seen as a sign of submission, but as a display of unparalleled strength. It was a refusal to stoop to Edward's level, a testament to his dignity and discipline. As the crowd watched, their initial discomfort transformed into admiration for the guard and condemnation for Edward. The whispers grew louder, a collected voice rising against the injustice they had just witnessed. "Enough," someone muttered, their voice barely audible but heavy with meaning. Edward, sensing the change in atmosphere, glanced around nervously. For the first time, his confidence faltered. The crowd was no longer amused by his antics. They were judging him, and the weight of their disapproval was palpable. Yet, Edward was not one to back down easily. He straightened his shoulders, determined to reclaim his dominance. "What's the matter?" He sneered at the crowd. "You're all so sensitive now. Can't take a joke." But the crowd was no longer laughing. Their silence was not one of fear, but of quiet defiance, mirroring the strength of the guard they now respected more than ever. Edward turned back to the guard, his frustration boiling over. "You think you're better than me because you can stand there like a rock. You're nothing but a—" Before he could finish, the guard moved. It was a small, deliberate movement, a slight turn of his head, his eyes meeting Edward's for the first time. The look was calm yet powerful, a silent declaration that Edward's words had no power over him. The crowd gasped. It was a simple act, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Edward froze, his bravado crumbling under the guard's unwavering gaze. In that moment, the balance of power shifted completely. Edward, who had sought to dominate and humiliate, found himself exposed and diminished. The guard, through his silence and composure, had emerged as the true victor, a symbol of strength in the face of adversity. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers drowning out Edward's feeble attempts to save face. He glanced around, his face red with humiliation, and quickly retreated, pushing his way through the sea of onlookers. The guard returned to his original position, his gaze fixed forward once more. He did not acknowledge the applause, did not react to the outpouring of support. He simply stood, a silent sentinel, embodying the discipline and dignity that had silenced a man and inspired a crowd. The test of silence. The plaza had settled into an uneasy quiet after Edward's retreat. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Tourists sharing hurried, hushed commentary about the confrontation they had just witnessed. Some were still recording, their phones held up like shields, but the guard remained stoic and motionless, a picture of unyielding professionalism. Amid the murmurs, a middle-aged man with a camera hanging around his neck turned to his wife. "That was something else," he said, shaking his head. "The way he just stood there, didn't say a word. Incredible." His wife, a soft-spoken woman with kind eyes, nodded. He didn't have to say anything. His silence said it all. "That other man," her voice trailed off, her disapproval evident. It was shameful. As the crowd began to disperse, their focus returned to snapping pictures and admiring the scenery. A smaller group lingered near the guard. Among them was a boy of about 10, clutching his father's hand. The boy's eyes were wide, his expression a mix of awe and curiosity. He tugged on his father's sleeve. "Dad," the boy whispered, "how come the guard didn't say anything? That man was so mean to him." The father crouched down, his face solemn. "Because, son, sometimes silence is the strongest answer you can give. That man wanted to make him angry, but the guard didn't let him win. He showed everyone here what real strength looks like." The boy frowned, trying to process this new idea. "But doesn't it hurt, Dad, when someone says mean things like that?" "It does," the father admitted. "But when you don't let it show, you take away their power. You stay strong for yourself." The boy glanced back at the guard, who stood as still as a statue, his gaze fixed forward. He nodded slowly, as if he understood. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, inside the guard post, Just a few steps from where the confrontation had taken place, a supervisor was monitoring the scene through a discreet window. Sergeant Lewis, a veteran of the Royal Guard, was a man who had seen his share of incidents involving unruly tourists. Yet this encounter had left even him unsettled. The guard who had faced Edward's tirade, Private Elijah Kane, was one of the newest members of the regiment. Elijah had joined the Royal Guard only 6 months ago, yet his composure under pressure rivaled that of the most seasoned veterans. Lewis watched Elijah closely. The young man's unwavering stillness during the ordeal was remarkable, but the sergeant knew that such encounters left invisible scars. He sighed, pushing open the door to step outside. "Elijah," Lewis called softly, his voice low enough not to draw the crowd's attention. Elijah did not move immediately. His training demanded absolute discipline while on duty. After a moment, he made a subtle gesture with his hand, acknowledgement without breaking his stance. "When your shift ends, come see me," Lewis added before retreating into the guard post. He trusted Elijah to remain professional until his shift was over, but the sergeant was determined to check in with him later. Silent strength, though admirable, often carried an unseen burden. Edward's bitter retreat. As the crowd resumed its normal rhythm, Edward stormed away from the plaza, his sunglasses pushed up onto his forehead. He muttered under his breath, his face still flushed with humiliation. Laura, his companion, followed a few steps behind, her unease evident. "Edward, maybe you should just let it go," she said hesitantly, her voice barely audible over his grumbling. "Let it go," Edward snapped, spinning around to face her. "That guard embarrassed me in front of everyone. He didn't even say anything, and yet he made me look like the bad guy." Laura flinched but didn't respond. She had seen Edward's temper before, and any attempt to reason with him would only make things worse. Edward's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his irritation giving way to confusion as he saw a notification. Someone had tagged him in a video. Curious, he tapped on the link, and his confusion turned to anger as the video began to play. It was footage of the confrontation, filmed by one of the tourists. The caption read, "When silence speaks louder than words." The comments were brutal, tearing into Edward's behavior and praising the guard's professionalism. Edward's name was quickly becoming synonymous with public disgrace. His hands trembled as he shoved the phone back into his pocket. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low and venomous. "The end of the shift." Hours later, as the sun began to set and the plaza emptied of tourists, Elijah finally completed his shift. He stepped into the guard post, where Sergeant Lewis was waiting. The older man gestured for Elijah to sit. "Elijah," Lewis began, his tone measured, "what happened out there today? I've seen it before, but I've never seen someone handle it as well as you did. You didn't flinch. Not once." Elijah shrugged, his expression calm but tired. "It's part of the job, Sergeant. We're trained to stay professional, no matter what." "That's true," Lewis agreed. "But professionalism doesn't make it easy. What that man said to you, it wasn't just about the uniform. It was personal. And that kind of hate, it can leave a mark." Elijah was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. Then he looked up, his eyes steady. "It did leave a mark," he admitted, "but not the one he wanted. His words said more about him than they ever could about me." Lewis nodded, impressed by the young guard's perspective. "You've got a strong head on your shoulders, Elijah, but if you ever need to talk about it, my door's open." "Thank you, Sergeant," Elijah said, standing. "But I'm okay, really." As Elijah left the post, the weight of the day lingered, but so did a sense of quiet pride. He had faced hatred and humiliation and emerged unbroken. And though he would never seek recognition for it, he knew that his actions had left an impression, not just on the crowd, but on himself. Echoes of the plaza. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the plaza where the events of the day had unfolded. The crowd had dispersed, leaving the space eerily quiet compared to the earlier chaos. Yet the weight of what had transpired lingered, rippling far beyond the confines of the plaza. Edward's reckoning. Edward Grayson sat in his hotel room, the curtains drawn against the golden glow of the evening. The luxurious suite, with its plush furnishings and panoramic city views, did little to soothe the knot of unease tightening in his chest. He tossed his phone onto the bed, its screen still glowing with the endless stream of notifications. The video of the incident had gone viral. The footage, captured from multiple angles, showed him berating the guard with venomous arrogance, while the stoic figure stood silent, unflinching. The comments were ruthless. How does someone act like this in public? Disgusting. This guard is the definition of strength. The other guy. Pathetic. Imagine thinking yelling at a man doing his job makes you superior. Embarrassing. Edward scrolled through the comments, his anger bubbling over as his public image unraveled. He had always prided himself on being in control of his business, his relationships, his narrative. But now the internet had seized the reins, painting him as a villain. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. Laura stood on the other side, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. "You're all over the news, Edward," she said bluntly as she stepped into the room. "Do you have any idea what kind of storm you've stirred up?" Edward ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room like a caged animal. "I didn't do anything wrong," he snapped. "That guard, he was mocking me with his silence." Laura raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Mocking you?" "Edward, he was doing his job. You were the one shouting insults at him." Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Edward turned away, his reflection in the hotel mirror a harsh reminder of the man he had become. The arrogance he had once worn like armor now seemed like a shackle, dragging him into an abyss of public scorn. Elijah's quiet night. Across the city, Elijah Kane sat in his modest apartment, the hum of the evening news filling the small living room. He had made it a point to avoid watching the footage of the confrontation, but the incident had found him regardless. He had returned home to messages from friends and family, their words a mixture of concern and pride. His younger sister, Grace, had called him the moment she saw the video. "You're all over the internet, Elijah," she had said, her voice brimming with excitement. "Everyone's talking about how you stood your ground. You're a hero." "I'm not a hero," Elijah had replied, his tone even. "I was just doing my job." Now, as he sat on the couch, his thoughts drifted back to the plaza. The insults Edward had hurled at him had cut deep, each word laced with centuries of prejudice and ignorance. But Elijah had made a choice long ago, not to let hate dictate his actions. The knock at his door startled him. When he opened it, he found his neighbor, Mrs. Bennett, standing there with a casserole dish in her hands. She was an elderly woman who often checked in on Elijah, her motherly concern a comforting presence. "I saw you on the news," she said, handing him the dish. "Thought you might need a warm meal after a day like that." Elijah smiled, touched by her gesture. "Thank you, Mrs. Bennett, but I'm fine, really." She studied him for a moment, her eyes softening. "You're a strong young man, Elijah, but even strong men need support sometimes. Don't forget that." Elijah nodded, her words sinking in as she turned to leave. He closed the door, the warmth of her kindness easing the tension in his chest. The public reacts. By the next morning, the video had become a cultural moment. News outlets dissected the footage, analyzing every word, every gesture, every second of silence. Social media was ablaze with commentary, and hashtags like #SilentStrength and #Guardians of Dignity were trending worldwide. In a small coffee shop, two young women sat discussing the video over steaming cups of tea. "Did you see how calm he was?" One of them said. "I don't know how he did it. If it were me, I'd have snapped." "Exactly," her friend replied. "But that's what makes it so powerful. He didn't need to say anything. His silence spoke louder than words ever could." At a nearby table, an older man nodded in agreement. We could all learn something from that guard. There's dignity in restraint. The discussion spread beyond coffee shops and social media. Schools used the footage as a teaching moment, discussing themes of racism, professionalism, and personal strength. Activists pointed to the incident as a stark reminder of the prejudice that still existed, while others hailed Elijah as a modern-day role model. Edward's collapse. In stark contrast to Elijah's rising admiration, Edward's world was crumbling. His business partners began distancing themselves, wary of the PR nightmare his actions had created. His inbox was flooded with emails from clients withdrawing their support. Sitting at his desk, Edward stared at his phone. He could still hear the guard's silence, haunting him like a ghost. It wasn't just the public's judgment that gnawed at him, it was his own. For the first time, he was forced to confront the ugliness within himself. Unable to endure the weight of his guilt, Edward did something he had never done before. He opened his laptop and began typing an apology. It was clumsy and awkward, but it was honest. An unexpected invitation. Back in the barracks, Elijah was called into the office of his commanding officer, Captain Rhodes. The captain, a stern but fair man, handed Elijah a letter with an official seal. "What's this?" Elijah asked, puzzled. "It's from the royal house," Rhodes said with a rare smile. "You've been invited to a private reception." Seems your actions didn't just catch the public's attention. They impressed some very important people. Elijah stared at the letter, his mind racing. He had never sought recognition for his work, but this was something he couldn't ignore. As he left the office, he felt a strange mix of emotions. The events of the plaza had been painful, but they had also sparked something larger than himself. Elijah knew he would attend the reception, not for the recognition, but for the opportunity to show that strength could take many forms, and perhaps, just perhaps, to inspire others to stand firm in the face of adversity. The turning point. The days following the confrontation at the plaza brought an avalanche of attention, much of it directed toward Elijah Kane. What had started as a moment of quiet professionalism in the face of humiliation had grown into something much larger, a global conversation about dignity, strength, and the resilience required to rise above hate. Elijah, however, remained grounded. As the world debated his actions, he went about his life, as he always had, with quiet determination. Yet he couldn't ignore the flood of letters, emails, and messages pouring in from strangers around the world. They shared their admiration, their own stories of facing discrimination, and their gratitude for his example. An unlikely ally. One of the messages stood out among the rest. It was an email, short and unsigned, but the words carried a weight Elijah couldn't ignore. "I need to talk to you. What I did was wrong. Please give me a chance to explain." Elijah stared at the screen, rereading the message. He didn't need to guess who had sent it. The tone, the desperation. It could only be Edward Grayson. For a moment, Elijah considered deleting it, dismissing the man's plea as another attempt to save face. But something made him pause. Could a man like Edward truly want redemption, or was this just another ploy? After a long moment, Elijah replied, "If you're serious, meet me at the cafe on Elm Street. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. The cafe meeting." The next morning, Elijah arrived at the small cafe 10 minutes early. He took a seat by the window, the warm aroma of coffee and baked goods filling the air. Outside, life moved on as it always did. Bustling commuters, parents with strollers, joggers with headphones in. At exactly 10 a.m., the door opened, and Edward walked in. He looked different from the arrogant man who had stood in the plaza just days ago. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes tired, and his usual air of superiority was nowhere to be seen. Edward hesitated when he saw Elijah, but after a deep breath, he approached the table. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," he said, his voice quieter than Elijah had ever heard it. Elijah gestured to the empty seat across from him. "What do you want to say?" Edward sat down, fumbling with the coffee cup he had ordered. "I've been I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about what I said. He looked up, meeting Elijah's steady gaze. And I realize I was wrong. Not just in that moment, but in a lot of moments in my life. Elijah leaned back, his expression unreadable. Go on. Edward swallowed hard, his words spilling out in a rush. I grew up in a world where people like me were told we were better, because of our money, our skin color, our status. And I believed it. I thought it was my right to treat people however I wanted. But that day, when you stood there and didn't react, he trailed off, his voice faltering. It made me realize how small I was, how much hate and arrogance were eating me alive. Elijah listened silently, giving Edward the space to continue. I've spent the last few days reading every comment, every post about what happened, Edward said. At first, I was angry, at you, at the crowd, at everyone who called me out. But then I realized they were right. And I hate that it took something so public to make me see it. Elijah's calm gaze didn't waver. So, why are you here? Edward hesitated, struggling to find the words. Because I want to change. I don't want to be that man anymore. And I know I have no right to ask this, but I need your help. I need to understand how to be better. Elijah studied Edward for a long moment. His initial instinct had been to dismiss this meeting as an empty gesture, but now, looking at the man before him, he saw something he hadn't expected: vulnerability, genuine regret. You can't undo what you've done, Elijah said finally, but you can take responsibility for it. That's where you start. Edward nodded, his expression earnest. I'll do whatever it takes. The reception. Later that evening, Elijah prepared for the private reception he had been invited to. The invitation, issued by the royal house, had come as a surprise. It was rare for someone of his rank to be recognized so publicly, but the incident had elevated Elijah to an unintentional symbol of quiet strength. The reception was held in a grand hall adorned with chandeliers and rich tapestries. Dignitaries, politicians, and prominent figures from across the country mingled, their conversations a low hum of sophistication. When Elijah arrived, dressed in his ceremonial uniform, all eyes turned to him. The room fell silent, and then, as if on cue, a round of applause erupted. Elijah was taken aback by the ovation, his natural humility making him uncomfortable with such public praise. An official approached, guiding him to the front of the room where a microphone awaited. Elijah's heart pounded as he stepped up to the podium. He wasn't accustomed to speaking in front of large crowds, but he knew this was an opportunity he couldn't waste. Thank you, he began, his voice steady but soft. I'm honored to be here tonight, but I need to make something clear. I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just did my job. The audience listened intently, their eyes fixed on Elijah as he continued. The incident at the plaza wasn't about me, he said. It was about something much bigger, about how we treat each other, about the dignity and respect that every person deserves. It's easy to respond to hate with anger, but sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand firm in your values. He paused, scanning the room. I hope that what happened serves as a reminder, not just for me, but for all of us. That strength isn't about power or control. It's about compassion, resilience, and the courage to rise above. When he finished, the room erupted into applause once more. Elijah stepped away from the podium, feeling a mixture of relief and pride. He hadn't sought this spotlight, but if it meant sparking change, he would embrace it. A ripple effect. The reception and Elijah's speech became headlines the next day, cementing his status as a role model. Schools, businesses, and organizations began reaching out to him, inviting him to speak about his experience and the lessons he had learned. Meanwhile, Edward Grayson quietly began his journey of redemption. He attended workshops on diversity and inclusion, volunteered with organizations fighting systemic inequality, and made a public apology that went viral for its raw honesty. Though their paths were different, both men had been irrevocably changed by that day in the plaza. Elijah's strength had not only inspired a crowd, it had transformed a man who once believed he was beyond redemption. Redemption and reflection. The ripples of the confrontation at the plaza continued to spread, touching lives in ways Elijah Kane could never have anticipated. For Edward Grayson, the man who had once prided himself on his arrogance and privilege, it marked the beginning of a painful but transformative journey. For Elijah, it was a reminder of the power of silence, resilience, and the quiet strength that lies in standing firm against hatred. Edward's redemption. Edward's journey began with an uncomfortable reckoning. The days following the viral video had forced him to confront not only the public's condemnation, but also the reflection of himself that he saw in their words. Every comment, every repost, every discussion about the video laid bare the ugliness of his actions. He had spent years building a life that revolved around his ego, and now it was crumbling under the weight of his own behavior. His first step was accountability. After his meeting with Elijah, Edward took to social media to issue a public apology. Unlike the half-hearted apologies often crafted by public relations teams, Edward's words came from a place of raw honesty. "I made a mistake, a terrible one. My actions in that plaza were cruel, thoughtless, and inexcusable. I insulted a man who showed more dignity and strength than I could ever hope to possess. I want to apologize, not just to him, but to everyone who saw what happened. I am deeply ashamed, and I'm committed to learning, changing, and doing better." The response was mixed. While some applauded his willingness to own up to his actions, others remained skeptical, dismissing his apology as an attempt to salvage his reputation. But Edward didn't let the criticism deter him. He knew that redemption wouldn't come through words alone. It would require action. He began by reaching out to organizations that focused on combating racism and promoting diversity. One of them, the Equality Initiative, offered a series of workshops that challenged participants to examine their biases and privilege. Edward enrolled in every session, sitting in rooms where he was forced to listen, to learn, and to confront truths he had long ignored. At first, the experience was uncomfortable. Edward was used to being the loudest voice in the room, but here he was expected to stay silent and absorb. He heard stories from people who had faced discrimination, not just in isolated incidents like the plaza confrontation, but every day of their lives. Their courage and resilience humbled him, forcing him to reevaluate everything he thought he knew about himself and the world. One day, during a session on systemic inequality, a young woman named Amara shared her story. She spoke of being overlooked for promotions, of being treated as if her worth was tied to the color of her skin, and of the countless microaggressions she endured daily. As she spoke, Edward felt a lump form in his throat. He realized that he had been one of those people, someone who judged others based on shallow stereotypes, who had contributed to the very systems that oppressed people like Amara. When the session ended, he approached her. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said. "Your story, it opened my eyes to things I should have seen a long time ago." Amara looked at him, her expression unreadable. "It's good that you're starting to see," she said, "but don't just thank me. Use what you've learned to make a difference." Those words stayed with Edward, becoming a mantra that guided his actions moving forward. Elijah's reflection. While Edward embarked on his path of redemption, Elijah found himself navigating the newfound spotlight. Invitations poured in from schools, universities, and organizations, asking him to speak about his experience at the plaza. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something he felt comfortable with, but the messages he received from people around the world convinced him that his story had meaning. At one of his first speaking engagements, a small community center in a quiet town, Elijah stood before a room filled with young people. Their faces were eager, their eyes filled with curiosity. He took a deep breath before beginning. "What happened at the plaza wasn't just about me," he said. "It was about all of us. It was about how we choose to respond to hatred, not with more hate, but with resilience. I stood my ground that day because I believed in something bigger than myself. dignity, respect, and the power of silence. The audience listened intently as Elijah shared his journey, not just the events of that day, but the years of hard work, discipline, and challenges that had shaped him. He spoke of the strength it took to remain calm in the face of adversity and the importance of standing firm in one's values. After the talk, a young boy approached him, his small hand clutching a crumpled piece of paper. "Mr. Kane," he said shyly, "I wrote you a letter. It's not much, but I wanted to thank you for showing me what a real hero looks like." Elijah knelt to accept the letter, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "That means more to me than you know." As the boy walked away, Elijah opened the letter. Inside, written in wobbly handwriting, were the words, "You made me believe I can be strong too." The paths cross again. Months later, Elijah and Edward crossed paths once more. The occasion was a panel discussion organized by the Equality Initiative, focusing on resilience and reconciliation. Elijah had been invited to share his story, while Edward, now a volunteer with the organization, had been asked to speak about his journey of change. When Edward saw Elijah backstage, he hesitated. The last time they had stood face to face, Edward had been a man consumed by anger and arrogance. Now, he felt the weight of that moment all over again. "Elijah," Edward said, his voice tentative, "I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully make up for what I did, but I want you to know that I'm trying." Elijah regarded him for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he extended his hand. "It's not about making up for the past," he said. "It's about what you do moving forward." Edward shook his hand, a sense of relief washing over him. In that moment, the weight of his guilt began to lift, replaced by a determination to continue on the path of growth. A message to the world. The panel discussion was streamed live, reaching audiences across the globe. Elijah's words resonated deeply, but it was Edward's vulnerability that left many viewers speechless. "I was the man in that plaza," Edward admitted, his voice trembling. "I said things I'm ashamed of, things that came from a place of ignorance and hate. But that day, I saw what real strength looked like." Elijah Kane didn't just stand his ground. He showed me a better way. And because of him, I'm learning to be better too. As the panel ended, the audience rose to their feet, their applause echoing in the hall. For both Elijah and Edward, it was a moment of closure, not an end, but a beginning. The legacy of strength. Months turned into years, but the confrontation at the plaza and its aftermath remained etched in the public consciousness. What began as a tense encounter between a royal guard and an arrogant tourist had grown into a global conversation about dignity, resilience, and the capacity for change. Elijah Kane and Edward Grayson's paths, though vastly different, continued to intersect in unexpected ways. Their stories became intertwined, each man's growth and actions reflecting the power of transformation, not just for themselves but for the countless lives they touched. Elijah's leadership. Elijah's quiet life as a royal guard shifted in the years following the viral incident. Though he remained dedicated to his role, his newfound recognition brought opportunities he had never imagined. Invitations to speak at international conferences, schools, and advocacy groups became regular occurrences. Initially hesitant to step into the spotlight, Elijah grew into the role of a leader, his words carrying the weight of lived experience and unwavering integrity. One of the most impactful moments of his journey came during a United Nations conference on social justice. Elijah was invited to address an audience of world leaders, activists, and youth representatives. Standing at the podium, his ceremonial uniform crisp and his demeanor calm, Elijah spoke with a conviction that held the room captive. "Strength isn't about the loudest voice or the biggest presence," he said, his voice measured but firm. "It's about standing firm in your principles, even when the world tries to shake you. It's about choosing dignity over retaliation, compassion over hate, and resilience over despair." He shared not only the story of the plaza, but also the countless microaggressions, challenges, and moments of quiet defiance that had shaped his life. He spoke of the responsibility each person has to challenge prejudice, to be a voice for those silenced, and to lead by example. As Elijah concluded his speech, the audience erupted into applause. Leaders approached him afterward, expressing their admiration and asking how they could implement the lessons he had shared. For Elijah, the moment wasn't about personal accolades. It was about sparking change on a larger scale. Edward Grayson's transformation was no less remarkable. The man who had once been defined by his arrogance and privilege had become a passionate advocate for equality and justice. After the viral incident, Edward sold his luxury consulting firm and dedicated himself full-time to causes that promoted diversity, inclusion, and systemic change. Through his work with the Equality Initiative, Edward helped develop programs that provided mentorship, resources, and opportunities to underrepresented communities. He collaborated with activists, educators, and policymakers, using his influence and resources to amplify their voices. One of his proudest achievements was the creation of the Kane Grayson Fellowship, a scholarship program named in honor of the man who had inspired his transformation. The fellowship provided funding and mentorship for young leaders from marginalized backgrounds, empowering them to pursue careers in public service, education, and advocacy. At the launch event for the fellowship, Edward spoke candidly about his journey. "I'm not proud of the man I was," he said, addressing the audience, "but I'm determined to make the rest of my life about lifting others up, about creating opportunities and breaking down barriers. And I owe that determination to someone who showed me, through his strength and silence, what true dignity looks like." A reunion of purpose. 2 years after the Plaza incident, Elijah and Edward were invited to a special event, a ceremony celebrating the creation of a monument in the very plaza where their lives had collided. The monument, titled Strength in Silence, depicted a royal guard standing tall, his posture unyielding with a subtle inscription at the base, "Dignity endures." As the two men stood side by side, facing the sculpture, the crowd gathered around them. Journalists snapped photos, and families whispered to their children about the significance of the moment. For Elijah, the monument was a symbol not of himself, but of the countless individuals who had endured and risen above adversity. For Edward, it was a reminder of the turning point that had set him on a path of redemption. When the speeches began, Elijah and Edward were both called to the stage. Elijah spoke first, his words calm and reflective. "This monument isn't about one man," he said. "It's about the strength we all have to stand against hatred and injustice. It's about the power of resilience and the responsibility we have to each other to build a better, more compassionate world." When Edward took the microphone, his voice was steady but emotional. "I stand here today as a changed man," he began. "I'm not the same person who stood in this plaza 2 years ago. I've learned that strength isn't about power or control. It's about humility, accountability, and the courage to face yourself. I'm grateful to Elijah for teaching me that not through words, but through his actions." The crowd erupted into applause as the two men shook hands, their shared journey a testament to the possibility of change and the enduring power of integrity. The legacy. In the years that followed, the story of Elijah and Edward became a cornerstone of discussions about personal growth and social justice. Schools incorporated their story into curricula, using it to teach students about resilience, humility, and the importance of standing up against prejudice. The Strength in Silence monument became a popular destination, not just for tourists, but for activists, educators, and anyone seeking inspiration. Elijah continued his work as both a royal guard and an advocate, balancing his roles with quiet determination. He remained humble, often redirecting praise to the larger causes he championed. Edward, now a sought-after speaker and advocate, used his story to show others that it's never too late to change. He often spoke alongside Elijah at events, their partnership a powerful symbol of reconciliation and growth. A final reflection. Years later, Elijah stood alone in the plaza, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the Strength in Silence monument. He watched as visitors read the inscription, their faces contemplative. A group of schoolchildren approached the sculpture, their teacher explaining its significance. Elijah smiled to himself, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. The plaza, once a site of humiliation and confrontation, had become a place of learning, inspiration, and hope. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Edward. "Thank you, Elijah, for everything. Let's keep changing the world, one step at a time." Elijah replied simply, "Always." And with that, he walked away, knowing that the legacy of strength, dignity, and redemption would endure far beyond his own footsteps. The legacy of strength. As Elijah left the plaza that evening, the crisp night air carried a sense of closure, yet also new beginnings. The Strength in Silence monument stood as a permanent reminder of the day that had changed so many lives. But Elijah knew that real change didn't rest in monuments. It rested in people. The ripple effects. Over time, the story of the plaza continued to inspire. Teachers used it to teach empathy, and activists used it as a rallying cry for justice. Across social media, the hashtag #StrengthInsolence became synonymous with resilience and courage, a rallying point for those seeking to share their own stories of standing up to injustice. One day, a letter arrived at Elijah's apartment. It was from a young woman in South Africa named Thandi. Her words, written in neat, slanted handwriting, brought tears to Elijah's eyes. "Dear Mr. Kane, I saw the video of you in the plaza, and it gave me strength I didn't know I had. I'm a teacher in a rural village, and I've faced my own share of prejudice and challenges. But your story showed me that I don't have to fight with anger. I can fight with dignity and perseverance. Thank you for showing me that strength isn't about how loud you are. It's about how firm you stand." Elijah folded the letter carefully and placed it in the small wooden box where he kept his most meaningful mementos. He realized that while the world had focused on what happened in the plaza, the real impact was in the countless lives that had been touched by its lesson. Edward's continued growth. Edward Grayson, too, carried the weight of his transformation with him daily. Though he had made great strides, he understood that growth was a lifelong process. Each time he spoke at a conference or mentored a young leader, he felt the lingering echoes of his past. But now, they served as a reminder of the man he never wanted to be again. One of Edward's most meaningful moments came when he was approached by Amara, the young woman who had once challenged him during a diversity workshop. Now a leader in her own right, Amara invited Edward to collaborate on a new initiative aimed at promoting racial equity in corporate leadership. "I never thought I'd be asking you for help," Amara admitted with a wry smile. "But people can change, and you've proven that." Edward nodded, humbled by her words. "I'm honored," he said, "and I'll do whatever I can to make this a success." The project, called Bridges to Equity, became one of Edward's proudest achievements, connecting underrepresented talent with opportunities across industries. It was a tangible way for him to give back, a testament to the lessons he had learned. A shared stage. 1 year after the unveiling of the Strength in Silence monument, Elijah and Edward were invited to speak at an international summit on reconciliation and progress. The event brought together leaders from all walks of life, united by a shared commitment to building a more equitable world. When Elijah took the stage, the room fell silent, the weight of his presence palpable. He began his speech with a simple truth. We live in a world where it's easy to respond to hate with more hate, to let anger consume us. But the strongest thing we can do, the hardest thing we can do, is to stand firm in our values and show that dignity will always outlast cruelty. He paused, letting his words sink in. The day in the plaza wasn't about me, and it wasn't about Edward. It was about all of us. It was about choosing to be better than our worst impulses, and it's a choice we have to make every single day. When Edward spoke next, his voice carried the weight of his journey. I was that man who gave in to his worst impulses, And I won't stand here and pretend I've erased the harm I caused. But what I've learned is that change is possible, not just for individuals, but for entire systems. It starts with humility, with listening, and with a willingness to do the work. The audience gave them a standing ovation, not just for their words, but for the courage it took to share their journey so openly. The closing chapter. As the years passed, Elijah and Edward continued their work, their shared legacy growing with each new story inspired by the plaza. The Strength in Silence monument became a global symbol, visited by people from all walks of life who found strength in its message. Elijah eventually retired from the Royal Guard, but his dedication to advocacy never wavered. He founded a mentorship program for young leaders, emphasizing the values of resilience, humility, and integrity. The program flourished, touching lives across the world. Edward, meanwhile, became a leading voice for reconciliation and reform. Though he never sought to erase his past, he used it as a powerful example of how even the most flawed individuals could find redemption through accountability and action. In the end, their paths diverged but remained forever connected by the events of that fateful day. Both men carried the lessons of the plaza with them, living proof that strength is not about overpowering others, but about uplifting them. Epilogue. A lesson for the future. Decades later, a young boy stood with his family at the Strength in Silence monument. His father knelt beside him, pointing to the inscription. "Do you know what this means?" his father asked. The boy shook his head, his wide eyes fixed on the statue. "It means that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand your ground without saying a word. It means that dignity and strength aren't loud. They're quiet, steady, and unbreakable." The boy nodded, the weight of the words settling in his small chest. As he stood there, gazing up at the monument, he felt a spark of understanding, a quiet determination to carry the lesson forward. And so the legacy of strength, resilience, and redemption lived on, passed from one generation to the next. A reminder that even in the face of hate, dignity can prevail, and silence can speak volumes.